Johnny Carson was staring at the cue card in his hand. And for the first time in 17 years, he was about to do something that could end his career. The words written on that card weren't his, they weren't true, and in exactly 90 seconds, 23 million Americans expected him to read them like he'd read thousands of cards before. But Johnny had made a decision that would split his life into before and after. He was about to say 6 words that nobody had approved, nobody had written, and nobody saw coming. November 19th, 1979, Studio One at NBC in Burbank, California. It was supposed to be just another Monday night taping of The Tonight Show. Johnny had his monologue ready, his guests were prepped, and the audience was buzzing with that electric energy that made the show America's favorite late-night ritual. Ed McMahon had just delivered his trademark introduction, the band had played Johnny through the curtain, and the king of late night was doing what he did best, making America laugh. The monologue was killing, jokes about President Carter's approval ratings, California traffic, and the upcoming holidays. Standard Carson material, flawless timing, perfect delivery. The audience was eating it up. Everything was running like clockwork. Then something happened that the 300 people in that studio and 23 million viewers at home didn't notice. Fred de Cordova, the show's executive producer, appeared at the edge of the stage holding a white cue card. Nothing unusual about that. Johnny used cue cards constantly, sometimes for joke setups he might forget, sometimes for sponsor mentions, sometimes for important announcements. It was part of the machinery of live television. But this time was different. Fred's face carried an expression Johnny had learned to read over nearly 2 decades of working together. It was the look that meant, corporate wants something. You're not going to like it, but we don't have a choice. Johnny took the card during a commercial break. The audience was stretching, chatting, unaware that anything was wrong. Ed was sipping his coffee. Doc Severinsen was adjusting his trumpet. Everything looked normal. Johnny read the card once. Then again, his jaw tightened, a subtle movement that his closest crew members recognized as Carson's tell. When he was angry, really angry, the card contained a scripted apology, 6 sentences long, written by NBC's legal department and approved by 3 different vice presidents. The network wanted Johnny to apologize for a joke he'd made 3 nights earlier, a harmless bit about a senator's spending habits that had somehow offended the wrong people. People with power, people who'd made phone calls to NBC's parent company, people who could make problems disappear or make problems multiply. "I can't read this," Johnny said quietly to Fred. "You have to," Fred whispered back, his voice urgent. "This came from the top. If you don't read it, they're threatening to pull the show for 2 weeks. Do you understand what I'm saying? They'll pull us off the air." "For a joke about government spending?" "Johnny, it's not about the joke. It's about who the joke embarrassed. Just read it. 6 sentences, that's all they want. Then we move on." The commercial break was ending. 30 seconds until they were back live. Johnny looked at the card again. It wasn't just an apology. It was a capitulation. It was Johnny Carson, the most trusted man on television, telling America that he'd been wrong to question authority, wrong to point out absurdity, wrong to do the job that had made him the biggest star in broadcasting. "Johnny, we're back in 20 seconds, the stage manager called out. Fred de Cordova's hand was on Johnny's shoulder. "Please, just this once, read the card." Johnny Carson had built his entire career on authenticity, on being the guy who said what everyone else was thinking, on calling out bullshit when he saw it, and now his own network was asking him to pretend that speaking truth was something to apologize for. 15 seconds. Ed McMahon was watching from his desk, confused by the tension he could sense but couldn't understand. The audience was settling back into their seats, ready for more laughs. Camera operators were checking their positions, sound technicians were adjusting levels, everyone was doing their job, completely unaware that Johnny Carson was about to make a choice that would define not just his career, but what television could be. 10 seconds. Johnny looked at Fred one more time. "If I read this, I'm telling every comedian in America that we're not allowed to challenge power, that we're just here to entertain and stay quiet. Is that what we're doing now?" "Johnny, 5 seconds." The red light on camera 1 blinked on. They were live. 23 million people were watching. Johnny Carson stood behind his desk, the cue card in his hand, and made his decision. He smiled, that famous Carson smile. The audience settled into complete silence, sensing something important was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny began, his voice steady and clear, "I've been handed a card here." Johnny held up the cue card so the audience could see it, though they couldn't read the words from their seats. "The network would like me to read this apology about a joke I made last Thursday, a joke about how our government representatives spent taxpayer money on private jets while telling us to tighten our belts." Fred de Cordova's face went pale in the wings. This wasn't the script. This was Johnny going rogue on live television with 23 million witnesses. "Now, I could read this card," Johnny continued, his voice still casual, almost conversational. "It's very well written. The legal department did an excellent job. Very professional, very safe, very—" He paused, looking directly into camera one. "Very not me." The audience was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the studio lights. Ed McMahon had stopped drinking his coffee mid-sip. The cameramen were frozen, unsure if they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. In the control booth, the director was frantically trying to decide if he should pull the plug. Johnny carefully tore the cue card in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the studio like a gunshot. "Instead, I'm going to say 6 words that are actually mine." The tension in that studio was suffocating. Fred de Cordova looked like he might have a heart attack. NBC executives watching from the control room were already reaching for phones to call their bosses. This was career suicide happening in real time. Johnny Carson looked directly into the camera, and with the same steady voice he'd used for thousands of jokes over 17 years, he said the 6 words that would change everything. "I will not apologize for truth." For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. The crew didn't know if the show was about to be cancelled mid-broadcast. America didn't know if they'd just watched Johnny Carson commit professional suicide. Then something unexpected happened. One person in the audience started clapping, then another, then 5 more. Within 10 seconds, all 300 people were on their feet, giving Johnny Carson a standing ovation that lasted 4 full minutes. 4 minutes of pure, unscripted support that NBC couldn't cut away from, because cutting away would have proven Johnny's point even more powerfully. Johnny stood there, visibly moved, as wave after wave of applause washed over him. Ed McMahon was crying openly at his desk. Doc Severinsen was applauding with his trumpet still in his hand. Camera operators were wiping their eyes while trying to keep their shots steady. This wasn't television anymore. This was a moment of collective defiance. 300 people telling corporate America that they were tired of being told what they could and couldn't hear. When the applause finally died down, Johnny did something else that had never happened on The Tonight Show. He sat down at his desk and spoke directly to the audience at home, ignoring his guests, ignoring the planned segments, ignoring everything except the truth he needed to say. "I want to tell you something," Johnny said, his voice quiet but firm. "For 17 years I've come into your homes every night. I've tried to make you laugh, tried to help you forget your problems for 90 minutes, and you've trusted me. You've invited me in. That trust is sacred to me." The control booth had given up trying to stop him. They were just letting it happen, knowing that intervening would only make things worse. "But that trust goes both ways," Johnny continued. "You trust me to be honest with you, and I have to trust that you're smart enough to hear uncomfortable truths, smart enough to laugh at powerful people, smart enough to question authority without burning down the house." He picked up the torn pieces of the cue card. "When networks tell comedians what we can and can't say, when corporations decide what truths are too dangerous for you to hear, when power protects itself by silencing laughter, that's when we're in trouble. That's when democracy doesn't work anymore." Johnny's hands were shaking slightly, but his voice never wavered. "I make jokes about presidents, senators, and powerful people not because I'm trying to tear down America. I do it because I love America, and I trust that you're smart enough to understand the difference between humor and hatred, between questioning authority and undermining it." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "So, here's what's going to happen," Johnny said, looking directly into the camera. "NBC might fire me for this, that's their right. But I won't apologize for doing my job. I won't apologize for treating you like intelligent adults, and I will not read words that betray the trust we've built together." What happened in the next 24 hours would determine not just Johnny Carson's fate, but the future of broadcast television itself. The show continued that night, but it was different. Johnny interviewed his scheduled guests, but the energy had shifted. Everyone in America knew they'd witnessed something historic. The phones at NBC didn't stop ringing. Thousands of calls flooded the switchboard before the show even ended. But here's what nobody expected. 97% of those calls supported Johnny. By midnight, Western Union reported receiving over 15,000 telegrams addressed to NBC. Support for Johnny Carson. By morning, that number had tripled. Newspaper offices across the country were overwhelmed with letters to the editor. Radio stations were taking calls from listeners who wanted to talk about what Johnny had done. This wasn't just a television moment. It had become a cultural flashpoint. NBC's executives spent the entire night in emergency meetings. The initial instinct was to suspend Johnny, make an example of him, show that nobody was bigger than the network. 3 different vice presidents drafted termination letters. Legal departments prepared for breach of contract lawsuits. Corporate communications wrote press releases explaining why NBC had no choice but to take action. But then someone made a phone call to the advertising department, and that phone call changed everything. Every single major advertiser that had bought time on The Tonight Show called NBC Tuesday morning with the same message: if Johnny Carson is fired, we pull our ads. Not just from his show, from your entire network. Procter & Gamble, General Motors, McDonald's, Coca-Cola. Every major brand that kept NBC's lights on made it clear that Johnny Carson had become more valuable than the entire network. Firing him wouldn't just end The Tonight Show, it would cripple NBC's revenue for years. By Tuesday afternoon, the president of NBC was sitting in Johnny Carson's dressing room, not summoning Johnny to his office, coming to Johnny. The balance of power had shifted in 24 hours. "Johnny," the network president said, "we need to talk about last night." Johnny was reading newspaper coverage of what was already being called Carson's stand. He didn't look up. "I assume you're here to fire me." "Actually, I'm here to apologize." Now Johnny looked up. "Excuse me?" "You were right," the president admitted, each word clearly painful. "We shouldn't have asked you to read that card. We panicked because some senator made threats. But you reminded us of something we forgot. The audience trusts you more than they trust us, and that trust is worth more than any politician's goodwill." Johnny leaned back in his chair. "So what happens now?" "Now we make you a promise. No more corporate-approved apologies. No more censoring your monologues to protect powerful people. You have complete editorial control over your content. It's in writing. Legal is drawing up the contract amendment right now. And if I joke about the wrong senator again," the president smiled grimly, "then that senator can be mad at you. But NBC won't ask you to apologize. Ever. That's the deal." What NBC didn't tell Johnny was what had happened behind closed doors. The network's research department had conducted emergency polling overnight. The results were stunning. Johnny Carson's approval rating among Americans was 73%, higher than the president, higher than any politician, higher than any religious leader. Only Mr. Rogers scored higher in trustworthiness. But more importantly, 68% of respondents said they would stop watching NBC entirely if Johnny was punished for telling the truth. The network had accidentally created a referendum on corporate control of media, and they'd lost, badly. By Wednesday, the story had reached the New York Times, Washington Post, and every major newspaper in America. "Carson refuses to apologize. America applauds," read one headline. "The 6 words that shook television," read another. Think pieces were being written about the power of authenticity, the importance of questioning authority, and whether corporations had too much control over public discourse. Other comedians started speaking out. George Carlin called Johnny the bravest man in broadcasting. Richard Pryor said Johnny had opened a door we all needed opened. Even comedians who'd never been on The Tonight Show recognized that Johnny had fought a battle for all of them. Johnny returned to The Tonight Show on Thursday, 3 days after his refusal. The studio audience gave him a 5-minute standing ovation before he could say a single word. When he finally spoke, his opening line became legendary. "Well, I still have a job. Turns out you people are louder than senators." The laughter that followed wasn't just about the joke, it was relief, celebration, victory, but the real impact of those 6 words, "I will not apologize for truth," didn't fully reveal itself for years. What Johnny had done that November night created a template that every comedian, journalist, and broadcaster would follow. He'd proven that audiences valued authenticity over corporate safety. That trust, once earned, was more powerful than any network's authority. Within 6 months, NBC had rewritten contracts for all their major talents, giving them more creative control. Other networks followed. The balance of power in television had permanently shifted. Johnny never spoke about that night in interviews. When asked, he'd deflect with a joke or change the subject, but people who worked with him said it changed him, made him bolder. The comedian who'd always played it safe had discovered that sometimes safety was the most dangerous choice of all. The torn cue card was never thrown away. Johnny kept both pieces in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. After he died in 2005, his family donated them to the Smithsonian. They sit in the American History Museum now, preserved behind glass, with a simple plaque, "The 6 words that changed television." But here's what the plaque doesn't say. Those 6 words reminded America that truth matters more than comfort. That laughter is how democracy questions power. That the people we invite into our homes every night have a responsibility to honor our trust, even when it costs them everything. Johnny Carson could have read that card, could have apologized, could have kept his job safe. Instead, he chose 6 words that risked everything he'd built. And in doing so, he proved that authenticity isn't just good television. It's the foundation of trust between a broadcaster and the people who believe in him. The joke he refused to apologize for? Nobody even remembers it now, but everyone remembers what happened when he stood his ground. That's the legacy. 6 words, and the courage it took to say them.